I work in the pro department of a home improvement company. I worked the closing shift with another cashier, who I'll call Aria. Aria's a really kind but quite timid cashier. She's also very pretty, so she has a lot of contractors hit on her. It's usually not that worrisome, though a few compliments, maybe a dinner invite, which she'd politely decline. I would probably ask her out as well if it wasn't for one detail: Aria does have a girlfriend. So being hit on by guys on a daily basis makes her rather uncomfortable. When we first met, I told her she ought to tell those guys about being gay, but she kept saying it wasn't any of their business, so she kept that part to herself. Aria has become my best friend, and having another cashier there with you keeps things from getting lonely. We even cover for each other's lunch breaks. One day, when I came back from lunch, Aria started telling me about this rather creepy guy who was flirting with her. She said she politely turned him down, saying she was with someone already, and while he didn't seem happy, he did leave. I shrugged it off as nothing more than the usual horny guy and laughed it off. But later that day, the man came back. Aria wasn't there, as she had left to help a customer find some lumber, so it was just me. He looked rather normal, probably handsome to most women, but he acted off. After looking around the area, I asked him if I could help him with anything. "I'm here to see Aria," he told me. I asked him how he knew her, and he said he had come in earlier and asked her out, to which she said yes, so he had come back in to pick her up. I told him she had left for the day, a usual lie everyone tells to cover for their friends. His smile went away as he started looking annoyed. He said he wanted to speak to Aria and ask her out again, which contradicted what he had just told me about accepting his previous invite. I told him he could not do that, which caused him to cross his arms and asked me why not. I'm not the best liar when it comes to making up excuses on the spot. However, I didn't want to tell him Aria was gay if she didn't want him to know it. So I just blurted out that Aria was my fiancée. His annoyed look went to confusion as he asked me how someone as pretty as she is could go out with someone like me. I'm not a Chris Evans or anything, but I don't think I'm that bad looking. I told him it didn't matter and that she and I were getting married in a couple of months, so he needed to back off. He gave me a death look but didn't say anything. After an awkward silence, he left. After Aria had gotten back, I told her what went down. She asked me to describe him, and after I told her what he looked like, she said that was the same guy who came in before. She was a bit creeped out by what went down but found the fiancé excuse rather funny. She even stated she'd rather be engaged to me than go out with him, which I'm guessing was a compliment. A couple of weeks went by, and we had all but forgotten about the man. At this point, one night after it had gotten dark, Aria and I were getting the trash together so we could close down the registers and go home. Just then, we heard a bang at the door, causing both of us to nearly jump out of our skins. It was the guy again. He had a wild look in his eyes as he kept his face pressed against the glass. "We're closed," I told him, but he insisted he needed to come in. Aria yelled again to tell him she's not interested and for him to go away and leave her alone. But he yelled that he's not here for her, he's here for me. He then says that if he can take out her husband, then she'd be all his. Based on that, he wanted to kill me. I told Aria to run to the manager's office and call the police, and I'd stay here and watch him. I won't lie though, I was pretty afraid to be in that tiny little area. If the guy was able to get in, he wasn't the biggest guy, but he could have had a weapon on him. Plus, the store doesn't allow us to have self-defense items on us, so I was on my own here. The guy then started ramming the sliding doors like he was crazy. The doors were rattling. I could have sworn they were going to come off their base. Just then, Arya came running back around the corner with a 2x4 in her hand, yelling that the cops were on their way. Finally, the man decided to leave. The closing manager met the officers when they came, and he took them to review the cameras. Thankfully, the man was caught and arrested, but Arya and I felt unsafe working there any longer. We're still friends and even attend the same college together, but we have separate jobs now while we pay our way through classes. I'm glad she was there to help me with the rogue man, as I hate to imagine what he might have done to me, or worse, what he might have done to her. She says she's glad I was there for her as well, as having a guy around tends to make men like him less confident in what they might try. It was a wake-up call for me as to how dangerous it can be for some girls when an interested guy just doesn't want to take no for an answer. I used to work as a night clerk in a downtown condominium. The association had a lot of security concerns due to the way the building was constructed back in the late 60s. Both levels of the parking garage were accessible from street level, so there were a lot of possible entry points, many of which were located in blind spots of the security camera system. For that reason, I was required to make 2 rounds around the entire building during my shift to make sure no non-residents had found their way in. The most serious issue we had was the occasional carjacking, but what I encountered most often was homeless people who had found their way into the garage and were huddling in some corner for a bit of shelter. Kicking them back out into the street was by far my least favorite part of the job, but I had to do it. After working there for several months, I knew all the spots that people liked to hide in. The building was very old and had undergone many renovations in its lifetime, which created a lot of nooks and crannies, unnecessary concrete protrusions, sealed-off rooms, and hallways and stairs that led to nowhere. The creepiest spot in the whole building was so weird and potentially dangerous that I took a picture of it and brought it up to management. On the first floor of the garage, there was a door that opened up to a corridor directly underneath the ramp up to the second level of the garage. It was about 3 feet wide and ran about 20 to 30 feet, but it led to literally nowhere. At the end of it was a large water pipe with a valve, which was the only reason the space existed. But in the dark, with just a weak flashlight, that pipe seemed to take on many other forms. What made it dangerous, however, was the lock on the door. There was no padlock or keyhole on either side, but on the outside was a large sliding bolt latch. There was only one way in or out, and it locked from the outside with no way to unlock it from the inside. Ever since I discovered the spot, I couldn't help but imagine how easy it would be for someone to get trapped in there. However, nothing I said to management made any difference. They were already aware of it and had no intention of doing anything about it. Unfortunately, that meant I would have to open the door and check on it every night, but I never stepped foot inside of it. I was way too scared of it. Things went on like that for months, and then one day my worst fear was realized. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, halfway through my shift. I was doing my rounds in the parking garage, and everything was normal. It was a slow Wednesday night. There hadn't been any problems or suspicious activity on the cameras, so I was far from on edge at the time. But then, in one moment, I was forced to go on alert. I heard the sound of a door slamming across the garage. I wasn't exactly sure where it was, so I walked over to investigate. My heart sank a bit when I saw that the door to the dead-end hallway was wide open. I looked around to see if anyone was in the garage, but I appeared to be alone. I shouted to intimidate anyone if they were hiding somewhere I couldn't see, but I got no response and nobody appeared. I was just worried that there was somebody hiding in the dead-end hallway, so I walked the rest of the way. I shined my flashlight down the hallway, and for a moment, I was relieved to see that nobody was in there. There was, however, an empty glass bottle about 10 feet inside. I sighed and rolled my eyes, thinking that somebody had been drinking in there and had run out in a hurry once they saw me snooping around, accidentally making noise as they rushed. It wouldn't have been that hard for somebody to climb up on the cars parked there to get above the wall and hop the fence into the neighboring parking lot. By the time I got there, since the garage was partially underground in that spot, in fact, that's how a lot of people get in because the dead-end hallway happened to be in a prominent blind spot of the cameras. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to leave trash anywhere if I saw it, so I knew I had to pick up that bottle. Of course, I felt the anxiety bubbling up inside my gut just for knowing I had to walk a few steps inside that hallway. I almost didn't do it, but I rationalized myself into thinking there was no way somebody would pop out and lock me in. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, but right as I reached the bottle, the door slammed shut. I immediately ran back to the door, but by the time I got there, it was already locked. I started banging on the door and screaming for help, but there was nobody there. I felt like I was being buried alive, like I could barely breathe. If it weren't for my flashlight, I would have been in some deep trouble. I wouldn't have been able to see a thing. Once I realized I wasn't getting out anytime soon, I reached for my phone. To my utter heartbreak, however, there was no service at all. The walls were made of cinder blocks, the door was made of metal, and the entire 6-story building was on top of me. No matter what I tried, I couldn't call 911. There was absolutely nothing I could do. I was completely stuck. The only way I was getting out was if somebody opened the door from the outside. But it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and it would be hours before anybody left for work. During that time, whoever trapped me was doing whatever they pleased in the parking garage. I heard several car alarms go off, and I knew what was happening. Somehow, they all turned off after a few minutes. I kept banging on the door and shouting, but nobody came. After a while, if I'm being completely honest, I gave up hope that I would be free anytime soon and just focused on staying calm. I sat down against the wall and turned off my flashlight to save the battery, but only after making sure I was completely alone. Every few minutes, I banged on the door a bunch of times. It took me about 2 hours, but finally, I managed to get the attention of somebody going to work early in the morning. I thanked them as they let me out, but unfortunately, the next thing I had to do was call the cops because I quickly noticed that a dozen cars had been broken into. There was broken glass all over the parking lot from all the windows that had been shattered. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to trap me in there and how to silence the alarms of the cars they were breaking into. We only had security guards on the weekends, and it left us vulnerable on a seemingly benign Wednesday. All in all, there were tens of thousands of dollars in damages and theft, and I was fired from my job. Not that I would want to go back anyway. The culprit was never identified on the cameras and was never caught. I've been a night owl my whole life, so I work night shifts exclusively. I really don't work well with other people, whether they're my coworkers or not, so I picked a job I could do completely on my own. I became a nighttime janitor for my local school district after I graduated from high school. Schools have always had nightly cleaning as part of health codes in most areas, but obviously, in recent years, it's become much more important. My first job was in a fairly large K-12 school. There were a couple of daytime custodians as well, but at night it was just me and one other person splitting the school down the middle. My coworker and I barely ever interacted, which I appreciated a lot. Every single night, all the floors get mopped, revacuumed, every desk, table, and door handle is disinfected, and every toilet, urinal, and sink also gets cleaned. It takes a full 8-hour shift to accomplish, and for that entire time, I don't talk to a single person. It's great, honestly. Most of my coworkers are women, and they don't want me talking to them either. When I tell people about my job, a lot of them think the hardest part is cleaning up after the messes left by the students. For the most part, I guess they are right, but I always tell them I would rather plunge and clean 10 clogged and traumatized toilets every single night than ever have to work directly with another human being all day long, especially a horde of minors. These days, there's one example I give of why I say that. It was the night after Halloween. I came in for my usual shift and got started without even saying hello to my coworker. We started on opposite ends and met in the middle, so we would only see each other when we were finishing up. The first hour was mostly normal except for one obvious thing out of the ordinary. I always keep my music at a low volume on my headphones, but from outside them, I kept hearing things. Usually, all the other faculty are gone by 8 p.m., but sometimes there's somebody who stays late. I couldn't decide what I was hearing through my music, but I wasn't in the mood to turn it off, so I just ignored it. A little while later, I took a break from mopping to change the water in the bucket. I was gone for about 5 minutes, but on my way back to where I stopped, I walked past one of the hallways I had just mopped and noticed the wet floor sign had fallen over. For legal reasons, I had to step over the wet floor and stand it back up, then mop back over my tracks. Annoyed, I walked over to it but froze for a moment when something else caught my eye. There was another set of tracks in the water, leading to and from the sign. They were little footprints, something a kid would make. After I stood the sign back up, I followed the tracks, knowing I would have to mop over those too, basically redoing the whole hallway. The tracks ran all the way to the end, where there was a flight of stairs up to the second floor. From there, they dried up pretty quickly. I stormed up the stairs and got to the second floor, but nobody was there. I took my phone out of my pocket and paused my music so I would be able to hear if anyone was running around. Right as I looked down, I saw a flash of movement at the end of the hallway. I also heard a bunch of footsteps echoing across the empty school, so I started making my way to the end of the hall. By the time I got there, I still couldn't see anyone, but then I heard a little kid laughing. It felt like I was in a horror movie, but at that point, I was more annoyed than scared. I stood there looking around for a few seconds until I heard a crash from the first floor. I rushed downstairs and nearly flipped my lid when I saw the mop bucket I had just refilled was knocked over. The water was spilling everywhere in a huge pool. I absolutely swore my head off as I went back to the nearest janitor's closet for a dry mop and a bunch of towels. It took me half an hour to clean up that mess and then another 15 minutes to redo the hallway that got messed up, which meant my break was down to 15 minutes. However, I was so pissed off that I walked to the other side of the school and interrupted my coworker to ask if she had been messing with me. She looked completely dumbfounded and innocent. She asked if I was all right or needed any help, but to that, I just walked away. I set up again and got back to work. Another hour passed, and I managed to make up some lost progress. I was angrily powering through it, debating in my head the whole time about what I should do. I thought about reporting it to the school or maybe just calling the police myself, but in the end, I figured I would seem crazy to everyone, just like I did to my coworker, so nothing happened. Again, until 11 o'clock, out of nowhere, the lights shut off in the whole school. It was pitch black for about 3 seconds until the emergency lights turned on, giving everything a reddish hue. It came as a shock to me, and to be honest, I was worried. I tried to tell myself it was a malfunction or maybe some kids messing around, but my mind was going to all sorts of possibilities. I had keys to the electrical room where the light switches were, and I was the closest to it, so I stopped what I was doing and marched over. I was pissed off about losing more time and missing out on my entire break. But halfway there, something pushed those concerns out of my head. I heard the most blood-curdling scream of my life, the panic shriek of my coworker echoing endlessly. I stopped in my tracks, feeling like I had just been hit by an electric shock. Seconds later, I heard the sound of a door opening really loudly, like someone was ramming through it from the inside. I hoped it was my coworker escaping and not somebody else making their way into the school. I forced myself to keep going and finally made it to the electrical room. I was right outside the door trying to find the right key when I noticed that it was already cracked open. I pushed it open slowly, afraid of what I might see, and a shape appeared in front of me, standing unnaturally in the darkness. My blood ran cold. It could have been anyone. I gave up on trying to turn on the lights and instead reached over for my phone in my pocket. However, as soon as I moved, the figure bolted forward and slammed the door in my face. I cursed and jumped back, stumbling until my back hit the wall behind me. Once I regained my balance, I started running. I wanted to leave, but for once in my life, I thought about the well-being of somebody else and ran to the other side of the school to find my coworker. After checking a few of her hallways, I finally found her mop bucket sitting alone in the middle of the floor next to a bathroom. Without hesitation, I rushed over to it, hoping not to see any evidence that she had been hurt. Nothing seemed unusual except for the fact that she was nowhere to be found. I looked all around in the dim lighting, but as far as I could tell, I was alone. But not completely alone. The sound of a laughing child echoed in the distance again, striking fear into my chest. I clutched the handle of the mop, for lack of anything else to defend myself with, and lifted it out of the bucket, holding the end of the handle out like a spear. I faced the direction of the laughter, looking down the hallway so intently I got tunnel vision. In a moment of sheer terror, someone whispered, "Hello," into my ear. I turned around and, without thinking, jabbed the handle of the mop into their chest with all my might. I heard a grunt as the person who snuck up on me hit the ground and vomited only a second later. I shouted at them to tell me who they were, but then they started to cry. I could tell they were trying to hold it back, but they couldn't. Gradually, my eyes made out what I was looking at. It was a student kneeling on the floor. Suddenly, all my fear of danger was replaced with the fear of losing my job for hitting a student. However, as things shook out over the next few days, it turned out all right. Two twins in the 9th grade and their little brother got the idea to keep the spirit of Halloween going and prank the overnighters in the school by hiding in the lockers. There was one set of lockers in the whole building that wasn't in use and had no locks or ties on them, and those kids were skinny enough to fit in there and hide. After doing their after-school activities, they managed to avoid being expelled, probably from crying a lot. The school district understood my actions and let me keep my job, but I was transferred to a different school. All in all, this is why I don't like people, especially kids. Up until about a year ago, I worked at a grocery chain. I was, and still am, a working college student. My availability was only 6 p.m. to closing, which in this case was midnight. It wasn't my favorite job. I dealt with a lot of annoying customers and coworkers, one of whom once broke into my locker and put a used tampon in the pocket of my apron, but that's a whole different story. My job was walking distance from where I lived, which made it really convenient since I didn't have a car. One Friday night, I was closing as usual with my supervisor, and we were running later than we usually did. My supervisor and I finally got the remaining customers out of the store, clocked out, and left. I left before my supervisor and began walking home. After a long, frustrating day of annoying customers, it felt great to just walk through the fresh winter air. I spent a few minutes shuffling through my phone's playlist to find a song to walk home to. I had made my way down the main road, careful not to slip on any of the ice. One thing that's really important to know about me is that I'm a very anxious person, and while it's definitely a problem most of the time, it does help make me constantly aware of my surroundings. That's when I saw an approaching car slowing down on the deserted main road, and I automatically went on high alert. It was a black car that came to a slow stop against the sidewalk I was on, about 10 feet behind me. I immediately clutched my phone in my hand and brought it out of my pocket. If there wasn't any ice covering the sidewalk and my feet didn't hurt, I probably would have run. Instead, I opted to try and pretend that I wasn't afraid, which I don't think worked because I picked up my pace after the car stopped. It was then that I heard a man's voice call out to me. "Hey, it's cold out here. You want a ride?" the man said. I kept walking away from him up the street, pretending I didn't hear him and just hoping he would go away. It didn't work. A few moments later, I heard the car tires crushing the ice on the road and then turned around to see what he was doing. He was now driving with the car in reverse. When he caught up to me, he had rolled down the passenger seat window some more. He was a black man, maybe in his mid to late 30s. He looked at me and I stopped, prompting him to stop his car as well. "Hey, let me give you a ride," he said through the car window. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to be polite because even though I was scared, I tried to be rational. All he did was offer a girl a ride home who was walking in the cold at night. Also, with the possibility of him being a kidnapper or a rapist, it was really best not to piss him off on the empty street. "No thank you," I said politely but firmly that I hesitated for a second. I was trying to figure out what to say that would get him to leave me alone away which street I lived on. "I'm okay," I insisted. "Thanks, though." As I finished thanking him, I started walking again, now putting both headphones in with the song paused. It was more of a way to signal that I was done talking to him. He didn't say anything, but I knew that he was watching me walk away. I felt relieved when I got a few more feet away from his car and heard the sound of his tires driving away. Unfortunately, the situation was only getting worse. As I started walking past the entrance of a car dealership, I saw the same car making a U-turn in the middle of the street out of the corner of my eye. When I turned slightly, he pulled up to the sidewalk yet again, this time a few feet in front of me. The man then opened the driver's seat door and got out of the car. It was at that point I was actually afraid I wouldn't make it home that night. He looked at me with this weird expression on his face. He had this really focused look while trying to look casual. It's really hard to describe. He started walking up to me. This kind of situation had never happened to me before, but I always thought of dangerous hypothetical situations in my head. I guess thinking about those situations prepared me to an extent because before I even realized it, my phone was already against my ear like I was on the phone with someone, even though I wasn't. When he came closer to me, he saw my phone in my hand and must have realized someone could know where I am right now, or I could be calling 911. That's the only explanation I can think of because when he looked at my phone, his demeanor totally changed. He stopped in his tracks with a worried look on his face and then asked me, "Oh, are you on the phone with someone right now?" I replied, looking at him with my phone still against my face and my other hand casually in my pocket. Without saying anything else, the man immediately turned around, got back in his car, and then started to drive up the street. I walked slowly at first, letting some distance grow between us, but as soon as I felt safer, I walked up the street as fast as I could without slipping. I frantically tried to call my dad, who I thought was home at the time. He didn't pick up. I then tried to call my sister and my fiancé. I didn't feel like I was in danger anymore, but my adrenaline was through the roof and I wanted to hear from someone who would make me feel better. I gave up calling after I couldn't get in touch with anyone and just kept walking. I was finally getting ready to turn onto another street when I passed an empty parking lot and saw the same man leaning against his car looking over at me. "Hey," was all he said in a flat tone when I walked by. At this point, I was completely freaked out. I didn't have my phone out anymore, so I couldn't pretend I was talking to someone again, and I was also significantly closer to my house. If he decided to get into his car and follow me, there wasn't any detour I could take to try and lose him. I was now on the verge of tears, and that's when I decided to call 911. I called 911 and told them the situation. The officer on the other line stayed on the phone with me until I got into my house. After that, an officer came to my house and asked me a bunch of questions about the man. He also asked me about his car and where I last saw him. All of the details were either too vague or I didn't remember. He said that he would at least patrol the area for him. I'm not really sure if he actually did or not, but it made me feel better at the time. From that point, I needed a ride to and from work every shift until I got my schedule changed to day shifts. Just a few weeks later, the college semester ended and I was planning on skipping a semester anyway. That experience only reinforced my decision. The more I think about that situation, the more I realize how lucky I was. I was in the perfect position to be taken, but I actually used some quick thinking that really de-escalated the situation. I moved in with my fiancé, and now I have a pocket knife and pepper spray for whenever I walk home at night from my new job. It's something to remember: if you haven't called 911, if you don't have anything to defend yourself against someone, either let someone know where you are or pretend that they know where you are. It can potentially save your life. Years ago, I worked as a barista at a locally owned coffee shop that doubles as a popular venue for local artists and musicians to host all sorts of small-time gigs. Even today, it gets most of its business in the evenings during the open mics and stays open until 1 a.m. However, when I worked there pre-2020, they were open 24/7 from Thursday to Sunday. For the most part, everyone that worked there hated the graveyard shift. It was easy hours, but the tips were abysmal as barely anyone came in. As far as I was concerned, however, I didn't mind the lower pay. What I hated was being alone and running the only place that was still open for miles. The shop was in a good part of town, if not a little close to a bad part, but the fact of the matter is that there's really no such thing as a good side of town during these overnight hours, if we're being completely honest. I was advised to never keep more than $50 in the drawer during the graveyard shift for a reason. I was always afraid that somebody would drag me into the back of the store, so every time I was scheduled for the overnight shift, I asked one of my male friends to come hang out with me. The one guy who would help me more than anyone else was named Bob. It usually turned out to be a good time. I made some money, I slipped him some beers under the table, and of course, I felt much more comfortable not being a woman on her own. Bob would work on his laptop while I was busy, and we would talk when things were slow. We had been friends for a while, but we became close after spending a lot of time together. It was always platonic, though. Bob was also friends with many of my coworkers, and lots of us joked that Bob knew so much about the coffee shop that he might as well work there himself. But he always laughed it off and said his career in photography was more important, which we always gave him a hard time for. I didn't really think there would ever be any bad blood between us, and if there was, I was sure it would be because we slipped up and had an awkward one-night stand. But then came a slow Saturday night in the summer of 2019. I was working the last overnight shift of the weekend. I had worked the last 2 nights in a row without Bob because he had bailed on me to go to a wedding for one of his family members. I managed to get another friend of mine to fill in for him for Thursday and Friday, but on Saturday night, they were too tired and never showed up. I was anxious about being alone in the shop, but I knew I could manage. Thankfully, it was surprisingly slow that night for some reason, and by 3 a.m., I had only made $10 in tips. But I was glad I didn't have to deal with any crazy people. Unfortunately, that's when things took a dark turn. The shop was completely empty except for me. I was putting a batch of coffee into the roaster when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure walk past the front window. I glanced over, but there was nobody there. I waited for someone to come around to the back door, which customers could also use, but a full minute had passed now, and nobody came. I stuck around by the register for a few more minutes, but after nobody showed up for a while, I decided it was time to mop the floors. I went into the back to fill up the mop bucket, and of course, as soon as I turned the faucet on, I heard somebody come in through the front door. I shouted that I would be with him in just a minute, then finished filling up the bucket and rolled it out behind the counter. When I got there, whoever came in had disappeared. I shrugged it off, just figuring they had gone straight to the bathroom, and then I started mopping behind the counter. The stranger's feeling hovered over me. I couldn't place what it was, but I knew something was wrong. The first thing I looked at was the drawer, but it hadn't been broken into. Even then, that would have been loud enough for me to hear over the running water. I leaned over the bar and checked the bathroom doors. The men's room door was closed, and the light was on, so I knew somebody was in there. My stomach churned slightly as I knew it was a man in there, but so far I had no real reason to think anything was wrong, so I just kept on mopping. When I finally got finished behind the counter, the bathroom door opened, and to my surprise, Bob walked out. I immediately felt a sense of relief, but I had to ask him what he was doing there. He explained that he had just gotten home from the wedding and thought he'd stop by and say hi. I was grateful that he decided to show up, so I told him he could have whatever he wanted on the house. I got behind the espresso machine and got to work pulling a shot. I packed the grounds into the portafilter and locked it into the machine, then looked over to say something to Bob. But whatever I was thinking of saying was immediately forgotten. His facial expression had gone from friendly to devilish in just a moment of time, and suddenly a wave of chills went through my body. "What are you doing?" I asked, fighting back trembling. Bob grinned like a psychopath and pulled a knife out from behind his back. "I'm finally going to bang the barista," he said as he started to laugh. "Don't be crazy," I shouted. "We're friends." "What about the cameras?" Bob began walking forward, forcing me to backpedal. "We are friends," he said, "and nobody will believe you because the cameras aren't even on." "They never are." "How do you not know that?" I knew at this point I was being pushed into the back of the shop, and my throat started to close up. It was also in that moment, when I looked for an exit, that I realized he had locked both the doors and turned the open sign off, keeping anybody from coming in. "Your boss already thinks we do this every night," Bob pressed on, inching closer and closer. "Stop it." I shouted in desperation, looking for something to defend myself and trying not to slip on the wet floor. "Shut up," you screamed. "You should have been giving this to me for months already. Do you not know how much time I wasted on you?" I was pleading and about to be cornered. The last hope I had was something on the sandwich counter. In the last moment before he pushed me out of sight into the back of the shop, I grabbed for the panini press and ripped it off the table, slamming the corner of the metal against the side of his head. He tried to block me and sliced open my arm, but I connected the hit. Combined with the water on the floor, the blow knocked him off of his feet. I wasted no time climbing over the counter and rushing out of the back door. I slipped into my car while I locked myself in and called the police. It wasn't until I thought about driving off that I realized Bob had parked his car in front of mine to deliberately keep me from getting away. Moments later, while I was on the phone with the operator, he came outside and attempted to break his way into my car. After he failed to do so for several minutes, he gave up and drove off, not long before the police arrived. I was treated for my wound and gave my statement about what happened. I didn't leave out a single detail. I was too much in a state of shock to even be in disbelief. As it turns out, he was right about the cameras inside the shop just being for show. However, nobody thought I was lying about what he did. Unfortunately, though, due to civil liabilities on the part of my employer and, more importantly, the fact that Bob completely up and disappeared after posting bail, I decided to drop the charges. I came to the conclusion not long after that he had already ruined his life sufficiently, and I simply didn't care enough to do anything else about it. Nobody has seen or heard from Bob in years, and the coffee shop has since stopped staying open overnight.